Welcome to this short screencast about understanding and responding to incidents. So, you've been engaging with some of the patient safety material within this e-learning, and I'm sure from that material you'll have got the idea and started thinking about when error occurs in healthcare. So we're going to follow on that safety section, thinking a little bit more detailed about human error and how that occurs in healthcare settings really, and then thinking about what we do about it and how we respond to try and make sure we have improvements in the future. So take a look at the pictures on the screen. In all of the photographs that you can see, human error was a feature of the incidents which occurred. At the top we've got a high-profile rail disaster where many people unfortunately lost their lives. Down at the bottom in the left-hand side there's the Zeebrugge ferry disaster where the doors of the boat were left open as the ferry set sail. In the middle, something more contemporary, that's the Smiler ride at Alton Towers, where human error was cited as the cause of the problem for some time. And then the final image is the Space Shuttle Challenger taking off, and unfortunately, shortly after takeoff, it exploded on its way out into space. So for all of the incidents that we can see on the screen there, human error was cited as a factor that caused the problems to occur. I'm not going to deny that human error was a feature. What I want you to think about is whether knowing it was a human error and a human did something wrong is necessarily helpful. Sometimes when we recognise that a human has done something wrong, it means we apportion blame, rather than looking for the cause of that human error. A far more healthy approach to take, really, is to think about, well, what caused the person to make the human error? And that can be require us to challenge our biases, really, and to be willing to look a little bit more deeply. And depending on the culture and the environment where you work or where you go on placement, people will adopt different approaches to this. And certainly at the moment, within some health and social care settings, we know we aren't understanding human error as well as we should be. And it's very easy to say, oh, well, so-and-so did something wrong. That is the problem, not why did so-and-so do something wrong. So in all of the pictures we can see here on the screen, yes, somebody did do something wrong, but we don't know why. Well, we do know a little bit more why now because these have all been investigated. The train crash at the top, for example, occurred on a very small section of railway that didn't have automatic signalling. The rest of the entire country had an automatic signalling system. But to cross to a very small section, it relied on the driver making a phone call to have the barrier lifted up. The system there wasn't helpful, and it comes as no surprise really that a lapse of concentration led to that incident occurring. So the system did not support the people involved to do the right thing at that time. So the picture is no different in healthcare really. Human error features very often within incidents which occur. So there's a few images on the screen and I'll just talk around a few examples really of where we see this as a feature and where we recognise or people say that human error is the cause of our problem. So the picture of the little boy at the top is baby P. I'm sure through your course you've heard the story of baby P who lost his life through neglect and abuse by his mother. The services, Health and Social Care Services, were heavily criticised during the inquiry into his death for failing to recognise and respond appropriately. Human error in terms of communication, lack of leadership and teamwork were attributed for some of the factors involved in not picking up the warning signs around the severity of abuse that this young boy experienced. The picture next to that is of a pressure ulcer. So sometimes that can occur, pressure ulcers occur for many reasons, don't they? But sometimes it's because we may have failed to recognise that somebody's skin is fragile, or we might not have been able to turn them sufficiently, and nobody's saying that there wasn't some error there on somebody's fault, but is one person to blame, or is it the system that really contributed to that being able to occur? The same thing with medication errors. Thinking about when medication errors occur, one of the often cited reasons for this in administration is thinking about distractions. How often do you see nurses distracted when they're administering medications? Whether that's distracted by other staff, or whether that's distracted by patients that they're working with, or other patients, leading to a lapse in concentration and the potential for human error to be there. So nobody's saying that there isn't human error. We're just saying that blaming the cause of a problem on human error and do nothing about the reasons why the human committed the error is not helpful. The final image there is of Dr. Baba Garba, who was involved in an incident where a little boy lost his life at Leicester Royal Infirmary. It's a really interesting case to look at, and it's been very high profile, so if you haven't heard of this case, that might be worth you having a little look at. But again, this doctor held her hands up that she made a mistake. When you read around the case and the various things that were going on, this doctor had only very recently, literally days, returned from maternity leave herself. She was placed in charge of an excessive amount of areas and tried to escalate the care of a young boy who was very sick. So there were some mistakes that she made, but the system certainly did not support her to be able to deliver high quality safe care. So pinning it all on this person possibly doesn't seem fair. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So, you may have got my opinion already as we've been talking, or as I've been talking over the last few slides. It's not helpful to pin all responsibility at the door of a person who's involved in an incident that occurs. And doing that is called a person-centred approach, thinking all about the person who made the error rather than anything else. An alternative approach would be a system-centred approach, which looks at the system and thinks about how the system could support somebody to do the right thing, or how it might encourage them actually to make mistakes. So maybe I'll just tell you a quick story to try and illustrate my point there. My clinical background is in critical care, and several years ago now, when I was fairly in a junior position, there was an incident which occurred where one of the nurses administered a unit of blood to a patient via the nasogastric tube rather than venous access as they should have done. Now, when this incident first occurred, I was pretty horrified. I'll be honest, I was judgmental. How could anyone make such a daft mistake? I was also like, oh blimey, I best make sure that doesn't happen to me. And that was the learning that I took away. I wish I knew then what I know now. And actually thinking about that person involved in the incident, it was about more than them making the mistake. There were other factors going on. At that time, we probably didn't think about a system-centred approach to patient safety. We thought about a person-centred approach. So unfortunately, the nurse involved in the incident was moved to another area because she was deemed to be incompetent. Do you think any more incidents like that occurred? They sure did. Because I suppose really this is the bad apple theory. The theory that if we remove a person who's causing us problems, the problem goes away. And perhaps you'll all be able to reflect on your own life and realise that is rarely the case. And certainly in this case, the incident repeated itself. Because all we'd done is change a person, removed a person in this case, not done anything about the system. So what is interesting to look at is a little bit more about what was going on in the incident when the nurse gave the blood through the nasogastric tube rather than intravenously. So when you look a bit deeper, what you find is the patient who was due to receive the blood had been suffering with delirium and had been very agitated for 5-6 days. They hadn't slept at all, had been constantly pulling out all of their lines, so their central line, nasogastric tube, very agitated, very difficult to manage. They'd finally fell asleep. This unit of blood was due to be administered on a night shift, so it was late. And because the patient had fallen asleep, the lights were down. The nurse, they were in a side room on their own, and the nurse didn't want to wake them up, so was very quiet, creeping in, didn't want to put a light on anything that would wake them up and cause them further distress, and actually further harm, because delirium is really serious. The patient was slumped over to one side and had a nasogastric tube that had a 3-way tap on the end to allow aspiration and flushing, as well as medication and nasogastric feeding to occur. The patient also had a 4-lumen central line, with each lumen, so each little line, having a 3-way tap on it. And as the patient was slumped over, the nasogastric 3-way tap and the central line 4 3-way taps were all clumped together. Now, we don't know exactly what happened, which led her to select the 3-way tap on the nasogastric tube, but it certainly, in my mind, makes it easier to see why it was easy to make that mistake. So the second time this incident happened, people were more interested and thought, perhaps it isn't the person after all. And 3-way taps were removed from all nasogastric tubes. They weren't to be used. And guess what? That was a system-centred approach, and as far as I'm aware, in that particular department, the incident never occurred again. So hopefully you can see that as an illustration of the two different approaches, and how kicking out the bad apple rather than digging really underneath and really trying to understand what was going on isn't that useful. Okay. So, just to summarise really what we've been talking about, we are not saying that people don't make mistakes. People certainly do make mistakes, but to really understand error better, we need to acknowledge that and just look beyond it as well. Generally, what happens when incidents occur or when harm gets through to a patient and causes a problem is that somebody has made an active failure. Somebody has done something wrong. But there's something called latent conditions, and latent conditions are things that lie dormant in the system and catch us out on the days when we're not looking for them. So a good example of a latent condition might be, let's think of a drug storage cabinet or a fridge full of vaccinations in a primary care setting. This is a commonly occurring incident in primary care where lots of different vaccinations are stored in very close proximity and different doses for different sized children, and it's very easy to select the wrong dose. So that might be a latent condition. Just like buying look alike and sound alike medication, or storing two things that look alike and sound alike very close together. Very easy to make the wrong selection when stressed or very busy, or when the light's down or something like that. So generally what we're talking about when an incident occurs is the fact that these two things have combined together. Somebody's done something wrong, and there's been a latent condition sat there waiting to crop up and trip us up when we're not looking for it. So we need to look for what the latent conditions are. We need to look for when our things are slightly suboptimal within our systems. So with that in mind now, I'm going to stop the screencast, and I'd really like you to take a look at a film. It's a very short film. It's just called The Swiss Cheese Model, and it talks about the Swiss Cheese Model, which is a model for error, human error, by James Reason. So take a look at that, and then join me for the second part of this screencast, where we'll move on and we'll think about responding to human error.